Picture a high ridge in the American Midwest rising sharply above the cold, wide waters of the Mississippi River. If you walk this ridge in the early morning when the fog is still clinging to the valley floor, the ground beneath your feet feels uneven, rolling in long, unnatural swells. To the untrained eye, standing at eye level, they just look like a series of low hills covered in oak and hickory trees. But if you were to look down from the sky, those random swells would snap into a terrifyingly deliberate shape. You would see 10 massive bears, each weighing hundreds of tons of packed earth, arranged in a perfect, silent procession. They are marching in a single line along the edge of the bluff, following the river, heading toward an unknown destination. And they have been walking this line for 1,000 years. For over a century, the people who found these earthworks have been trying to make sense of them. One group of men arrived with compasses, surveying chains, and measuring tapes, determined to crack a mathematical code they believed was hidden in the dirt. They saw a puzzle of geometry and engineering. But another group of people, the descendant tribes who traced their lineage back to this very valley, held a completely different understanding of what this line of earthen giants was doing. To them, these were not dead monuments or puzzles to be solved. They were something alive. We are looking at two entirely different ways of reading the landscape. One relies on the shovel and the map. The other relies on a memory passed down by voice for 50 generations. And the tension between these two views is what makes this place so compelling. What were the builders trying to say by placing 10 bears in a row? Why this specific animal, and why this specific arrangement? We are going to look at the dirt itself, at the earliest maps drawn by men trying to save these shapes from the plow, at the profound cosmological system remembered by the native peoples of the region, and at the one piece of evidence that tells us exactly why this march was set in stone. To understand what you are looking at, you first have to understand what the world was like when these bears were born. We have to go back to the late woodland period, somewhere between the years 700 and 1100. This is long before any European mapmaker even conceptualized the continent of North America. And the place we are standing in is geologically unique. It is called the driftless area. During the last ice age, when massive glaciers crushed and flattened most of the Midwest, they completely missed this one pocket of land across parts of what are now Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Illinois. Because the ice never ground it down, the driftless area remained a rugged, dramatic landscape of deep river valleys, sheer limestone cliffs, and high, narrow ridges. It was a hard landscape, but an incredibly rich one. The people who lived here were not struggling for survival. They had access to the bounty of the Mississippi River, the dense forests, and the prairies. And because they had this stability, they had time to observe, time to develop complex societies, and time to build. We tend to picture the ancient inhabitants of this continent as simple hunter-gatherers, moving constantly just to stay alive. But the sheer scale of the effigy mounds shatters that condescending assumption. Building just one of these bears was an act of staggering logistical organization. They had no draft animals. They had no metal tools. They had no wheels. Every single ounce of earth was dug with tools made of bone, wood, or stone. It was loaded into woven baskets, carried on the backs of workers, and deposited on the ridge. Modern engineers have calculated that a single large mound would require thousands of basket loads. Now multiply that by the thousands of effigy mounds that once covered this region. This was not the work of a few people passing a weekend. This was a multi-generational, civilization-level project. It required architects to lay out the design, leaders to organize the labor, and a shared spiritual conviction powerful enough to motivate the entire community. But what was that conviction? For centuries, the oral traditions of the Ho-Chunk, the Iowa, and other descendant tribes have provided the context that the archaeologists were missing. To them, the Earth is not a dead resource to be exploited. It is a living entity, and the universe is divided into distinct realms. There is the upper world, the realm of the sky, associated with birds and spirits of the air, most notably the thunderbird. And there is the lower world, the realm of the earth and water, associated with panthers, snakes, and bears. In this worldview, the bear is not just an animal. The bear is a guardian. It is a creature of immense power that commands the earth and the underground. The tribes speak of the Bear Clan, the people responsible for keeping order on the ground, for policing the camp, for managing the physical reality of daily life. The bear represents stability, physical strength, and connection to the soil. To build a bear out of the earth itself was to invoke that power, to anchor the landscape, and to communicate directly with the forces of the lower world. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet corners of history, the stories the textbooks skipped over, consider subscribing to this channel because that is exactly where we spend our time. So we have a people with a profound understanding of their place in the universe, and we have the massive physical effort they left behind. We're going to look at what happened when a completely different culture collided with these mounds, at the meticulous surveys that revealed the procession of the bears, at the physical evidence found inside the dirt, and at why the official explanations leave so much unexplained. The collision began in the 19th century when European and American settlers started pushing west across the Mississippi River. When they climbed the bluffs and found these massive earthen animals, they did not see a sacred landscape. They saw an obstacle to agriculture, or worse, they saw a mystery that challenged their worldview. This was the era of the mound builder myth, one of the most pervasive and damaging intellectual blind spots in American history. The settlers simply refused to believe that the ancestors of the Native Americans they were actively displacing could have built something so monumental. So they invented a convenient fiction. They convinced themselves that a lost race of white people, or ancient Egyptians, or wandering tribes of Israel had built the mounds and had been wiped out by the local tribes. It was a useful lie because it justified taking the land. Under this myth, the mounds were not sacred sites to be preserved. They were curiosities to be plundered. For decades, men dug into the bears and the birds looking for gold, for giant skeletons, for anything that would prove their wild theories. They found none of it. What they did find, they often destroyed. Across the Midwest, thousands of effigy mounds were simply leveled by the steel plow. The rich soil of the earthworks was perfect for farming. Within a few generations, a landscape that had been carefully curated for centuries was largely erased. But in the midst of this destruction, a few men realized that something irreplaceable was vanishing. In the 1880s, a surveyor named Theodore Lewis began walking the river valleys, frantically mapping the mounds before they could be plowed under. He used a simple compass and a surveying chain, recording the exact dimensions and orientations of the earthworks. Decades later, in the 1920s and 30s, two Iowa researchers, Charles Keyes and Ellison Orr, took up the cause. They were the ones who truly recognized the significance of the South Unit, the area that would eventually become the Effigy Mounds National Monument. It was Ellison Orr who meticulously mapped the marching bear group, and what he recorded on paper changed the way we look at this site forever. When you look at Orr's maps, the sheer intentionality of the design hits you. This is not a random scattering of shapes. The marching bear group consists of 10 bear effigies, 3 bird effigies, and 2 linear mounds. The bears are arranged in a nearly straight line, following the contour of the ridge. They are all facing the same direction, moving down the slope. They are all built in profile, showing only 2 legs, which are universally placed on the downhill side. Here is the part that should not be possible to ignore. The dimensions are incredibly consistent. Some of these bears measure over 100 feet from nose to tail. They are raised 3 to 4 feet above the surrounding terrain, and the spacing between them is deliberate. They are not crowded together, nor are they scattered. They are spaced as if they are in motion, a frozen procession of giants. The surveyors, Keyes and Orr, approached this with the cold logic of science. They were looking for structural patterns, measuring the distance from the head of one bear to the tail of the next. But the more they measured, the more the official explanation of the time began to fracture. For decades, archaeologists had assumed that all mounds were primarily cemeteries. The conical mounds, the simple round hills found nearby, almost always contained human remains. But when they excavated the effigy mounds, they found something entirely different. The bears were largely empty. There were no massive tombs inside the bears. There were no grand hoards of grave goods. Occasionally, a small deposit of cremated remains or a single artifact might be found in the heart or head area of the effigy, but not always. The earthworks themselves were not just containers for the dead, they were the object. The shape itself was the purpose. And this is where the two lines of our story crash into each other. The surveyors proved that the mounds were not random, that they were engineered with extreme precision, and that they were not primarily burial sites. But science alone could not answer the question of why. Why 10 bears? Why march them in a line? Why place the birds between them? The official archaeological record was excellent at describing the what and the how, but it hit a wall when it came to the why. It left a void that people tried to fill with endless theories. Some said it was a defensive fortification, which makes no sense given the shapes. Some said it was a hunting decoy system, which is absurd given the scale. Every time investigators tried to close the case with a simple, utilitarian explanation, the absolute strangeness of the marching bears pulled it back open. Look at the topography. The ridge they sit on divides the landscape. On one side is the steep drop to the Mississippi River, the great highway of the continent. On the other side is the rolling interior of the driftless area. The bears are marching along a boundary. Now look at the inclusions. Scattered among the 10 bears are 3 bird effigies. Remember the cosmology of the descendants. The bird is the upper world. The bear is the lower world. Here, on this one ridge, the two realms are woven together. Coincidence stops being a comfortable word when you realize that the builders were physically mapping their entire religious system onto the earth. But there was something none of the early surveyors had fully accounted for. And when modern researchers finally looked at it, the whole case changed shape. For a long time, people assumed the effigies were just looking at the ground. But what if they were looking at the sky? In recent decades, archaeoastronomers began mapping the alignments of the effigy mounds against the celestial events of the late woodland period. They found that many of these earthen shapes align with the solstices, the equinoxes, and major star constellations. The marching bear group specifically presents a tantalizing possibility. In many Native American traditions, the constellation we call Ursa Major, the Great Bear, is also seen as a bear. And as the seasons change, the Great Bear appears to walk along the horizon. Is the procession on the ground a mirror of the procession in the sky? The alignment of the ridge roughly follows the path of certain celestial movements. This changes everything. Because it means the builders were not just marking territory, they were bringing the mechanics of the heavens down to the dirt. They were anchoring the sky to the earth. Now put it together. The oral tradition warned that the earth was alive and needed to be kept in balance. The early surveyors proved that the shapes were deliberate, measured, and devoid of the massive burials that would explain them away as simple graveyards. And the astronomical data suggests they are tied to the turning of the seasons. 3 sources looking at the same ridge through completely different lenses, all describing the same impossible thing, an instrument made of dirt designed to keep the universe in order. Which leaves only one explanation for what happened next, and it is the most unsettling part of the entire history. Around the year 1100, the building stopped. It did not fade away slowly over centuries. It did not gradually decline into smaller mounds. It just stopped. The people who had organized the labor, who had maintained the astronomical alignments, who had carried the baskets of earth to shape the marching bears, simply ceased the practice. For a long time, historians used this sudden stop to argue that the builders had been wiped out or had mysteriously vanished. It fed right back into the old myth of a lost race. But the archaeological record, when examined closely, points to a single explanation that historians resisted for decades. The people did not vanish. The climate changed. Around the year 1100, a period known as the medieval warm period began to alter the landscape of the Midwest. The growing seasons got longer, and with that warmth came a new technology that was just as disruptive to the late woodland people as the Industrial Revolution was to us. That technology was corn. Maize agriculture swept up the Mississippi River, and when a society shifts from seasonal gathering and hunting to intensive, settled agriculture, everything changes. The social structure changes. The way people view the land changes. You no longer need to travel in seasonal rounds to gather food. You need to stay in one place to tend the fields. And when your relationship with the earth changes from moving across it to digging into it for crops, your spiritual expression changes too. The marching bears were the ultimate expression of the late woodland worldview, a worldview based on balance, movement, and the harmony of the upper and lower worlds. When the corn arrived, the society reorganized. They formed larger villages. They built platform mounds for leaders instead of animal effigies for the spirits. The knowledge of how to build the bears and the specific reasons for marching them in a line was not lost to a violent conquest. It was deliberately let go, traded for a new way of surviving. So here is what actually happened on that ridge above the river, not the myth of a lost race, and not the cold dead math of a purely utilitarian surveyor. The version that every piece of evidence finally points to is far more profound. The marching bear group is a map, a clock, and a prayer all woven into one massive physical object. The builders recognized that they were living in a transitional zone, both geographically on the edge of the Great River and spiritually between the realms of the sky and the water. The 10 bears, representing the power and authority of the lower world, were set in motion to guard that boundary. The birds were placed among them to ensure that the upper world was represented, keeping the universe in balance. They were aligned with the landscape and the sky to track the passage of time, to anchor the seasons in the soil. The legend and the archaeological report were never in conflict. They were describing the same event from two ends of a millennium. The descendants remembered the meaning, while the surveyors measured the method. What connected them was the reality of the achievement. Think back to the evidence, the exact spacing that no casual dumping of soil could achieve. The lack of primary burials, proving the shape itself was the sacred object. The connection to the Great Bear in the sky. Each one, alone, could be dismissed as a quirk of history. Together, they leave almost no room for doubt. We are looking at the work of master engineers who were also master theologians. We cannot prove every last detail of the rituals they performed on that ridge. No one can, at this distance in time. We do not know exactly what songs were sung when the final basket of earth was laid on the head of the lead bear. But of every explanation ever offered, the idea that this was a deliberate cosmological monument to balance is the only one that leaves nothing unaccounted for. And that is the quiet weight of it. This was not a lost secret hidden by some vanished alien race. It was ordinary human brilliance, powerful enough to outlast the society that built it, and fragile enough to be abandoned in a single generation when the world changed. The people we so often picture as primitive were, in this, vastly ahead of us. They solved the problem of how to leave a permanent mark on the earth without destroying it. They built a monument that worked with the landscape, not against it. And then, when it was time to change, they simply walked away, leaving the bears to march on without them. But the answer to what the mounds are is not really where this story ends, because what it tells us about ourselves is the part that lingers. We like to think that knowledge only moves forward, that once humanity learns something, we keep it forever. But the marching bears are absolute proof that we do not. Entire systems of understanding, refined over centuries, involving thousands of people and massive logistical coordination, can vanish in a single lifetime. The builders of the effigies understood the earth in a way that modern society is entirely blind to. We nearly erased their masterpiece with our plows before we even stopped to ask what it was. We assumed we were smarter simply because we came later, and once you know the truth, a different question takes its place. It is not just about what happened to the builders, but about how much we lose when we call something a myth and stop listening. The native descendants tried to tell the early settlers that the mounds were sacred, that they held power, that they were connected to the animals and the stars. The settlers called it superstition. It took 100 years of surveying and archaeology for modern science to finally admit that the indigenous memory was right all along. They were not telling fairy tales, they were remembering a science of the earth. Everything you know how to do, every piece of history you hold, exists only because someone chose to pass it on. The moment they stop speaking, it is gone. These earthen bears are a monument to exactly that fragility. Remember the image we started with, the high ridge, the fog, the 10 massive shapes rolling through the trees. Look at that procession again in your mind. It is not just a strange curiosity anymore. It is a clock that is still ticking, a boundary line that is still holding, a message written in the only language that can survive 1,000 years of rain and wind. They are still marching. We are just the ones who finally remembered how to see them. So I want to ask you this. When you look at the landscape around where you live, what do you think is quietly hiding just beneath the surface? Is there a place, a local legend, or a strange ruin that everyone ignores but no one can fully explain? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely read them, and some of the best mysteries we investigate start right there in your local history. I really do want to hear your answer to that, because the conversations under these videos are half the reason I make them. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, the history that the textbooks quietly skipped, the mysteries that require a little more patience and a lot less shouting, then consider subscribing. That is the only way you will catch the next investigation, and I promise you, there are stranger ones coming. If this journey kept you here to the end, a like genuinely helps more people find the channel. That That is not a small thing. It is the whole reason independent historical research like this survives. Thank you for staying with me all the way through the trees and the archives. Keep asking why the quiet places are quiet, and I will see you in the next one.